So, hi everyone, my name is Bruce. I'm the Public Education Manager here at Chazon. I am very excited to introduce the first of our three-part series, Understanding Shmita, an Ancient Aspiration for Modern Times. This is actually the first of two series. This will be followed by a second series on Shmita and the natural world. Stay tuned, more information about that as we get going. But for today, I'll be running our Zoom line. So a few notes, please try to keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. If there's some background noise, I may mute you. It is not any offense to you, just to help us keep our lines clean so we can have a great session for everyone. You will also notice there may be transcription on the bottom of your screen. If you like that, please keep it. If you'd like to turn it off, if you go to the bottom bar where it says live transcription and there's a little icon that says CC, you can click that and you have the option to turn off live transcription. This session is being recorded and it will be available to all registrants of this session. And a recording will go out either tomorrow or the day after and will be sent out in the follow-up emails. Any text, there are no texts for today, but in the future, there will be, if there are texts that will be posted again on our event webpage. And if you have any issues at all, you can message me directly through the chat function. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nigel just to briefly introduce the series.
So, hi and welcome everybody. My name is Nigel Savage. I'm CEO of Chazon. I'm here in, as we're now going to call it, South New York. Bruce, I want to thank you for putting this all together. I want to thank everybody for joining us. The word Chazon means vision. Some of you know the organization well and some of you may be joining for the first time, but we're really trying to point Jewish life outwards to create a healthier and a more sustainable world for everybody. And doing that means that we need to leverage and inspire people, and we do that in a bunch of ways. We need to leverage and inspire institutions, and we do that in a bunch of ways. And we also want to engage with Jewish thought. How does Jewish tradition actually influence and address the real world that we're in today? And how does the world that we're in today help us freshly understand Jewish tradition? And that's how it is that over 14 years now, we've become steadily more and more interested, and some would say obsessed by Shmita. This little three-part series is in one sense well-timed because this week's Parsha, this Shabbat, which we read this week, Parshat Bahar, is one of the places in the Torah where the idea is introduced. But I would simply say at this point that to the extent that you're here, you're somebody who is who's interested in these things. We really thank you. And I really want to encourage us all, not merely as it were to learn now and from Jeremy and in this series, but to see ourselves as ambassadors for Shmita. It is something which across the Jewish world, if you first mention it to people, they scrunchel up their face because they're not quite sure why it should be interesting or why they should be interested. But we hope that by the end of this session, and by the end of this little series, you will have more sense of that. We'll remind you of this at the end, but there is a website, shmitaproject.org, which is an umbrella for all things Shmita. And if you're interested in things or doing things, please share them with us. And we may say a word about this at the end if we have time as well. We've also launched a series of Shmita prizes to encourage fresh thinking and art about Shmita. And there is information on that there too. With that, I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Jeremy Benstein, who is a friend, a colleague, and a teacher. The way this is going to work is that if you have a question that you want to put down a marker for at the end, feel free to put it in the chat now. But Jeremy's in fact not going to be looking at that while he's speaking or teaching. But if there is something that you want to ask that's little as he goes along and you don't think it's going to totally take him off track, then feel free to raise your little online you go to the reaction button underneath and you put up that. No, you don't put up that. You put up, how do I take it down? Dear Lord. I'm a terrible person here. You unraise it. Unraise it. In any case, lower your hand. Exactly. There you go. Raise that if you have a question. I want to say that Jeremy is an anthropologist, a linguist, a Jewish teacher, was co-founder of the Heschel Institute for Environmental Leadership, and is one of the most thoughtful people I know on this topic. He works now for 929, who are our partners in this. I'll let him say a couple of words on that. But Jeremy, really genuinely, thank you so much in joining us live from Israel. on a day in which you might be at the start of getting a new government. Over to you.
Leave me with that bombshell. Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm here actually with sort of two hats because as Nigel mentioned, I am one of the co-founders of the Heschel Center for Sustainability here in Israel, based in Tel Aviv. And also for the past few years, I've been working for this amazing Israeli project called 929, which is indeed the co-sponsor for this series. And I just put the link to the 929 website in the chat. Just very briefly, 929 is not a very famous Jewish number, but we're working on that. 929 is the number of chapters in the Tanakh. And like if you're familiar with the idea of daf, yomi, a daily Talmud study of a page a day. Well, this is Perek Yomi, a chapter of Tanakh a day, or five a week, actually. But the main thing that characterizes 929 is that there's a very rich and curated website of interactions and discussions and blog posts and video materials and art materials for each chapter, every day of the five days of the week. And Friday is a sort of a recap of the week, but is a new chapter with new materials and new posts and everything else. And the goal is to create this sort of, very broad-based and inclusive conversation around Jewish identity, and for the time being at least anchored in Tanakh. So you're welcome to check that out. As I said, it's an Israeli project. There's the website in Hebrew, and I'm the editor of the website in English, and that mainly services some English speakers obviously here in Israel, but mainly English-speaking Jews around the world, North America, Great Britain, South Africa, who we have represented here, as well as Australia, etc. And most of our writers come from those communities. So that's all that about 929. I'm sure that throughout this next part of the series, we'll also have Shira Hecht-Kohler, who is the education director of 929, based in New York, and other personalities. So I am going to jump right in. My goal today, I have no text and not even a PowerPoint, which is fairly strange for me. I usually have something to focus on besides my face. I just want to tell a story, because it's sort of a story that, even though I actually think the first thing I wrote about Shmita was like 22 years ago, very briefly. And then, of course, the big sort of Jewish renaissance of engagement with the ideas and values of Shmita was around 7 or 8 years ago. And Heschel, Chazon led, but Heschel and a bunch of other Jewish organizations were part of that. But this is really some sort of insight, or a sort of framing that I only really came to recently, although it's based on some teachings that I've learned from Rabbi Micha Odenheimer and some others. But my goal today is basically to demonstrate that Shmita is not some sort of Jewish agricultural trivia, like some bizarre things that we might or might not do, but it's actually a deep expression of the core vision of Torah and Judaism in general, okay? It really encapsulates I think, the social and economic vision of Judaism. I'll try to show that. Okay, one of the reasons why I got interested in this framing is that I think that part of the reason why Shmita is not more popular in the Jewish world is that it's kind of stands on its own. First of all, it's framed as something agricultural, and so if you're not a farmer, then what do you have to do with it? And obviously, that's not true, really. And I'm sure that in the next installations of this series, the next episodes, they'll be going more into the specific teachings of Shmita. I want to give sort of the backstory. I think one of the reasons why Shmita has not been so widely accessible is that it's not really integrated into or woven into our sense of our own story, our own history. What do I mean by that? Like, take Shabbat. Besides the fact that we have Shabbat every week, so that makes that obviously a lot more present in our lives, we often connect Shabbat to either creation, Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, that of course in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, it's sort of right there as a climax of the creation story, so it's definitely connected to that, and obviously frames some of our relationships to creation and the natural world. And it's also Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, that in interesting ways, which I don't have time to get into, it's connected to slavery and the freedom from enslavement. And it's meant to remind us of this day of freedom from subjugation to work, is meant to remind us of the Exodus from Egypt. So it's very much tied into those significant events in our Jewish sort of historical zikaron or memory. And Shmita is not, at least until now. So I'm going to try to do that right here. So let me begin by a question, and I guess we can call this a audience participation part of the program. Shmita, of course, and here I'm not going to talk a lot about the specific teachings of Shmita, and maybe I'll just say a word, since I'm not going to assume that everybody already knows what it's all about. But basically, the core teaching of Shmita is to let your lands lie fallow once every 7 years, and also debt relief, which is a sort of separate segment that appears in Deuteronomy. But basically, not to plow or sow or reap or do any of the major agricultural activities with your land. And not only that, but all lands need to be open and accessible to everyone. Okay, that you're not allowed to stop people from gleaning whatever's growing on your land. And you're also not even allowed to store food in your houses when there's no longer food available outside. Everything has to be free and accessible to all. It's kind of this radical vision of the commons. Okay, so a 7-year period of agricultural fertility. What story in the Bible does that remind you of? There are actually two possibilities here. The 7-year period of agricultural fertility. What does that call up? Feel free to unmute yourself and just kind of shout it out.
Egypt.
Okay.
Yeah,
go ahead.
When Joseph went down to Egypt and talked to Pharaoh about his dreams.
Okay, exactly. So if you think about 7 years of fertility, then the main thing that comes up is actually Pharaoh's dreams, right? The 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows, the 7 ears of corn and the blighted ears of corn, etc. The other possibility, I'll just put it out there, is Jacob actually working first for Rachel, but getting Leah, and then working again 7 years. So there's like a 7-year period there. I haven't yet discovered the deep connections with Shmita, although they might be there. So let's go back to Joseph and Pharaoh. So what happens is Pharaoh has these dreams, and Joseph is the only one who can interpret them. And he says there will be 7 years of abundance, 7 years of great harvest, etc., plenty of grain and food for everybody. But those will be followed by 7 years of famine, of perhaps drought, but certainly famine, no good crops, everyone's going to die. Okay, and so he not only interprets the message of the dream, but he then goes on, this is Genesis chapter 41, he then goes on and becomes essentially the development consultant to the crown. He says, let Pharaoh appoint overseers over the land and organize the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty. Let them gather all the food of these good years that come and lay up grain under the hand of Pharaoh for food to be stored in the cities. And the food shall be for a store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall come upon the land of Egypt, so the land may not perish. Okay, now Joseph is referred to as Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the righteous one, for all kinds of reasons, but certainly this brilliant plan of his, which he of course ascribes as well to God, but is also credited to his great virtue and his great perspicacity and wisdom and foresight and everything else, right? Of course, what a great idea. In fact, if God is already telling Pharaoh that this is what's going to happen, well, he's doing this so that we prepare ourselves. And that is exactly Joseph's suggestion. And then, okay, so they do exactly what they suggest, and they have these massive storehouse cities filled to the brim with grain. And then the 7 good years are over and the 7 lean years begin. And what do? The government, who has nationalized the surplus and stockpiled all this food, they sell it back to the people. Now, it doesn't seem to raise an eyebrow that this widespread disaster relief is not freely given, okay? They took it. They didn't buy it from the farmers. They took it as a tax and the farmers didn't mind. They had all this surplus. Why not? Let's give it to the government who rules the country anyway. But then it's sold back to them. So these stores, which were collected precisely for the purpose of safeguarding the people's lives, are monetized, and the royals, which is to say Pharaoh and Joseph, engage in what would be called profiteering, right? And the system at first probably didn't cause much of a problem for the farmers. They were rich, And they also didn't know, there was no transparency here. The farmers didn't know that there were going to be 7 bad years. And no farmer plans for 7 years of no harvest, right? And so the initial bad harvests were probably perceived as temporary. So Joseph and Pharaoh are privy to this divine prognostication that has allowed them to corner the grain markets and make ruthless use of their monopoly. And then I won't read all of Genesis chapter 47, but you were encouraged to go back and read that. It's very painful to read because you see the gradual impoverishment of the Egyptian people. Remember, there are no Jews, no Israelites there yet. We're still talking about an internal Egyptian story because first of all, they buy grain, but then of course they use up their money. And they say, well, we don't have any money left. So Joseph says, well, give me all your animals. So they buy grain in exchange for all the animals. So now all the money and all the livestock are held by the government. And then they run out of that. And so Joseph says, well, sign me over your land. Give me all your land. So all the land is nationalized. And not only that, but for some reason, it's not explained in the text, he uproots all the rural populations, right? They all end up going from one end of the country to the other. And then he continues to give them seed because they're completely impoverished. They have absolutely no possessions whatsoever. But in exchange for a 20% tax on the eventual grain that will grow in perpetuity, right? So just think about the nature of this society, and you have to ask, is it any wonder that this is the society that later on enslaved the Israelites? Okay, slavery was intimately bound up with this regime of accumulation, okay, of storing things up and using that to impoverish the population, the proletariat, if you want to call it that. And if you remember correctly, a little detail of the story is that the Israelites did not build the pyramids, whatever urban legends you may have heard to that respect. But if you read the text itself in Exodus chapter 1, it says they built arei miskanot, which are store cities. In other words, exactly those institutions that were used to accumulate all the wealth and keep it from the people was the object of the Israelites' labor. Okay, and so this is what happens when a canny tycoon is given both insider information and the keys to the kingdom. And so while it became a sort of hyper-feudal system, which is very far from capitalism, okay, it's not anything like we have today, although I'll talk about today by the end of this session. But this regime of amassing and hoarding, okay, here's something that was present during the year of Corona too, right? But this regime of amassing and hoarding is sort of a precursor of Karl Marx's famous quote, right? Accumulate, accumulate. This is Moses and the prophets. Okay, he didn't mean that that's what Moses was teaching, but he's saying this is the central teaching of capitalism. And if we do acknowledge the fact that Joseph and Pharaoh and the Egyptian regime, that in that situation, that both the capital and the means of production were appropriated by the ruling class, then it's not, we won't say that accumulate is Moses and the prophets, but it's Joseph and the pharaohs, okay? Or at least that's how I would rephrase it. So this is kind of the Ur image, right? This sort of a fixated image of a society, of a 7-year plan that's connected to agricultural fertility. It involves a property regime, it involves concentrated wealth, and it involves a very particular way of dealing with abundance and scarcity, okay? And in Yetziat Mitzrayim, in leaving Egypt, this is what they leave, okay? This is the anti-model. This is everything we're supposed to negate and leave behind. It's the exact negative of the Torah's vision of what a compassionate society is meant to be. Okay, so, but before we can talk about what that positive vision of a compassionate society is, with its alternative to what a 7-year cycle of fertility is about, we need, there's an important intermediate link, okay? And just as there is a transitional period that needs to be lived through in order to get from the house of bondage to the land of milk and honey, okay? So what does it mean to leave that Egypt that I just described? What can lead to a complete paradigm shift among this newly liberated people who have only known slavery and dependence and have only understood or only experienced a single response to fear and scarcity, which is to stockpile, to hoard, to concentrate, and to oppress? Okay, what would signify anti-accumulation, anti-control, anti-Egypt? Okay, it would essentially have to change their entire experience of their day-to-day lives, their day-to-day sustenance of what it is and how they get it. It would have to reinforce the idea that food should be a gift freely given to be enjoyed equally by all, that it shouldn't be stockpiled or owned or even bought and sold, that it exists to fill need and not greed. Okay, this sounds like a pretty tall order, right? To try to do that with one fell swoop, right? It would take a miracle. It would take like an amazing, surprising, wonderful boon. It would have to be like manna from heaven, okay? And that is exactly what it is, okay? The miraculous, mythical manna that the Israelites experience in the desert as their daily sustenance is the ultimate contradiction to Egypt and the slavery of Egypt and all that that represents, okay? In chapter 16 of Exodus, manna is given by God to feed the people in the desert. It falls every day. And crucially, it can't be hoarded or over collected or even stored, okay? Everybody gets exactly what they need to each according to their need, no more, no less. And those who don't trust the system, if you try to like sneak some on the side or salt some away, you only get stench and maggots, okay? That's what happens when you hoard. Significantly, manna is implicitly contrasted with slavery in the description of its collection in Exodus. It says, the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion. In Hebrew, that is laktu devar yom biyomo, okay? That day's portion. Now, interestingly, that phrase was used only a few chapters earlier when the Egyptian taskmasters had cruelly insisted that the Israelite fulfill their daily quota of bricks when they weren't given any straw anymore, that they would have to kaluma asechem devar yom biyomo. So for slavery, the daily quota was a minimum to be produced and to serve to the overlords for amassing their wealth. And for manna, the daily portion was a maximum, limiting personal acquisition and consumption. Okay, so we already get some echoes of the slavery period in the manna period and show how it's a contradiction to that. And the only time that there isn't this Devar Yom B'Yomo, when there's a double portion, is of course on Friday to collect it for Shabbat. In other words, to obviate work on the day of rest. So there you are allowed to set aside, but only for the sake of spiritual regeneration and not for the sake of amassing wealth. Okay, and amazingly, we have a halacha that comes from this, that's part of our weekly life, that comes from this agadah of the story of the manna and the double portion on Friday for Shabbat. That's one of the reasons why we have two chalot in our Shabbat meals to signify that doubling, the lechem mishneh of the manna on Shabbat. Okay, and so we'll come back to this linkage of manna and Shabbat and how it helps to inform the entire context of Shmita. Okay. Moving right along. The manna, of course, and again, if I'm not dealing here with realia of what it was like, if it really happened, if the Jews were in fact really in the desert, I'm dealing with the internal logic of the narrative as we have it, and essentially the values that are encapsulated in the Torah text. Okay, so the manna was unique to that time of wandering the desert, which of course that period also was unique. Okay, so what replaced the manna? Right? When did the manna stop? What could replace it? Right? This was this miraculous sufficiency of divine abundance, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we hear about this actually, we have to wait till the book of Joshua, where in Joshua chapter 5, it says that the manna ceased when the Israelites tasted of the bounty of the land of Israel. On the same day when they ate of the produce of the land, the manna ceased. The Israelites got no more manna. That year they ate of the yield of the land of Canaan. Okay? So that's one angle of the entrance to the land. And another is provided by Leviticus chapter 25. And I emphasize this simply because it's in this week's Parashat HaShavua. So it's very, very timely. And that's the chapter that essentially is the largest or most complete introduction to the idea of Shemitah. And there it states explicitly that immediately upon entering the land, the Israelite nation is meant to observe Shemitah. What does that mean? The beginning of chapter 25, when you enter the land, ki tavo el haaretz, when you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. Okay. Now, of course, you can try to take this out of its essentially simple contextual literal meaning, what's called the pshat, but it says that the first thing you do when you get into the land is that you start with a Shemitah. Okay, you don't have 6 years of agriculture and then 7 years later you have Shemitah. It says when you enter the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord, Shabbat Adonai, the Shemitah year. Okay, so first of all, when you put those two texts together, you get a whole nation going straight from being manna eaters in the desert to being Shemitah observers. Okay, and if that is the internal logic of the text, then the connection is obviously clear. Okay. And so that brings us back to this 7-year plan idea, right? If the basic laws of Shmita are that you're forbidden from tilling the land and commercializing what grows of itself, then you were thrown back essentially willy-nilly into essentially a gatherer economy, hunter-gatherer economy, right? You've sort of rolled back the Neolithic revolution of agriculture, and you were essentially trying to live off what the land gives freely of itself rather than trying to coax it through agricultural labor. And so when you add to that the laws that I mentioned, again, stockpiling Shemitah produce or even fencing in your property, and not to mention forgiving loans and getting people out of debt, you get essentially, Shemitah becomes a year-long anti-Egypt, okay? And that the manna was really only a foretaste of, that the manna was a transition from Egypt to anti-Egypt. And that was crucial for changing our perspective and giving us added depth about what that means. So in Egypt, the regime centralized production and distribution and sunk people hopelessly into debt. And the Shemitah paradigm does exactly the opposite on all those counts, okay? So again, that's why I see Shmita as not just representing some kind of agricultural technology or something like that, but is really like one of the central social and economic messages of the Torah, of what our world should look like, okay? Now, let me go back here. You say, well, that's kind of weird that they were able to observe the Shemitah before they even work the land. Isn't the Shemitah meant to be a rest for the land from our labor, right? We work it really hard. It gets tired or exhausted or depleted, et cetera, et cetera. The land needs to lie fallow to replace its nutrients. Okay, this is, I think this is a problematic way of reading Shmita, partially because of what it just said. If you know anything about permaculture, and I'm not a huge permaculturist, but they say that when you come to a place to start designing a permaculture intervention, a permacultural garden, the first thing you do is nothing, is be there and observe and just see the land in its fullness and in its wild state, ideally for 4 seasons, right? To really understand what the rhythms are and what the land needs. And only then can you intelligently and wisely make, do your human intervention in the form of a garden. And so what I read this as is essentially a permaculture kind of teaching, to come into the land and don't immediately come in with your plows and tractors and everything else, but sit back and try to get a sense of what the needs and the natural rhythms of that land are, okay? And so let's get back to this. The idea that this is reconnecting to Shabbat. So we have Shemitah and we have Shabbat, and each of them is a cycle, okay? Of course, the Shabbat is a 7-day cycle, a weekly cycle, and Shemitah is a 7-yearly cycle. And so when you have a cycle, sometimes it's hard to know where the loop begins, right? And most people, of course, assume that the Shabbat day comes at the end of the cycle. You work all week, and then you need to rest up and to be able to go back to the daily grind. In other words, you rest in order to work. That would be the Western economical rational approach to what rest is all about, that the work is the end goal and the rest is sort of what we need to do in order to fulfill that. That rest needs to be recovery and recuperation as a means for the sake of the end of productive labor. And if you would be thinking like that, if that's your interpretation of Shabbat, you would be thinking like an Egyptian, and significantly, it is false, okay? Even though Shabbat does come as the 7th day of the days of creation, that's kind of the divine scale. And of course, we know that God doesn't really need to rest. It's not for his rest and their rest and recuperation, right? And there's a beautiful midrash in the Talmud in Sanhedrin that asks the question, why was Adam created last in the order of creation? Okay, and essentially that means Friday afternoon, right? If you follow the creation story of chapter 1, all the different things are created in days 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then on day 6, all the major animals, and the last mentioned creation there is the human being, and then right away it is Shabbat. Okay, and so one answer, the rabbinic answer to that question, what do we learn from where Adam was placed in this order of creation, is so that Adam enters immediately into a mitzvah. Okay, you have to go directly into Shabbat. It's the first thing that the created Adam in the creation story experiences is Shabbat. But why? Why would that need to be the case? Clearly, right, they were fresh out of the wrappers, right? Their batteries needed no recharging, etc. The purpose wasn't rest, okay? And so I think that jibes totally with exactly what I've been trying to teach about Shemitah, that it's the beginning of the cycle. It is not rest rationally defined, meaning that it's a means to be able to simply work more productively, but it's a spiritual ideal to be obtained. And in this respect, Shabbat is not the end of the week, it is the ends of the week and of our existence. And this stands the whole labor-leisure relationship or the work-life balance, if you want to call it that, on its head. It implies being over doing, and certainly over having, right? And that's the connection with Shmita, okay? That we need to live life to be worthy of experiencing that rest, not just to use it as a way to work better, okay? And a little parenthetical comment, a teaching I learned from a great teacher of permaculture here, a Haredia woman named Talia Schneider. She said, if you look at the Leviticus text, which we're not going to do in detail, but the Israelites actually ask a really, really sensible question. They say, hey, wait a minute, we're farmers. What are we going to eat if we can't farm? This is in Leviticus chapter 25. How will we eat? And there God says, well, I'm going to, command my blessing onto the land. And in the 6th year of the cycle, the year right before Shmita, it will be so abundant and so fertile that you will have enough to get you through the 7th and even the 8th year before you can start harvesting your new crops again. Okay, but just think about that for a second, putting aside for the moment that it's a divine miracle, so we can't really ask questions of logic. But if the whole purpose of Shemitah was to recharge the gradually depleted land, that the land was getting increasingly depleted by our agriculture and it just had to recover from our ruthless interventions, then it doesn't make any kind of sense or logic, even internal to the story, that Dafka, as we say in Hebrew, Dafka in the 6th year, the year that would be the low point of the cycle, that would be its most productive, most fertile year, right? It only makes sense if we're doing a sort of agriculture that actually doesn't deplete the land, right? That is a regenerative form of agriculture that increases fertility, that helps build the soil, that contributes nutrients and things like that, such that when you get to the end of a 6-year cycle of this, you have created an incredibly rich and fertile environment such that you can just coast. Okay, that you have created this reality that allows you to experience Shemitah in all its abundance, right? Not having to survive Shemitah in all of its poverty and depletion. Okay, so this just, again, ties together Shabbat and Shemitah as these spiritual goals we have to work towards and in fact be worthy of to experience in our lives. Okay, I am sort of getting to the last section here, a little bit more to go, but hopefully plenty of time to hear your thoughts and questions and responses and everything else. So this actually brings us to where we actually are today. Well, second, I'll talk about today, 2021, globalized, late capitalism, etc. But today in the Omer, okay, we are counting, we had a 7-day cycle and a 7-year cycle, so let's not ignore the 7-week cycle, okay? Of course, we were meant to count the weeks between Pesach and Shavuot. Shavuot means weeks, so the holiday itself is a culmination of this 7-week period, and it is essentially counting the days. I mean, there are two kinds of counting here. There's the counting that is meant to signify the time from leaving Egypt to getting to Mount Sinai, because Shavuot is Chag Matan Torah, of receiving the Torah. So there's that connection from leaving Egypt, leaving the restrictions, etc., and then coming to Torah to get receive the document that would allow us to fully express our humanity, our spiritual freedom, the freedom to. We were free in Egypt from the freedom from restrictions, and now we have the freedom to develop, live some divine vision of a just society, etc., etc. But it, of course, is also an agricultural counting of the grain harvest, okay? Wheat, barley, etc. And that's why Shavuot is not just a holiday about Torah and about text, but it's also Chag HaBikurim, the holiday of the first fruits, and of course, the gratitude for entering into the land at all, okay? Now, interestingly, there are other connections, which I think sort of tie this whole story up into one nice little knot. When the new grain offering is brought at the end of the counting of the Omer, this is described in chapter 23 of Leviticus, what do we bring? We bring 2 loaves of bread. Okay, that's part of the korban, part of the offering that we bring, which of course echoes that double portion of manna. And there's even a connection between manna and the Torah, because we have, after the revelation of the 10 Commandments, or what do you want to call it, the revelation at Sinai, Torah mi Sinai, we have this thing called Aron HaBrit, the Ark of the Covenant, this big gilt-covered box, essentially, that was transported in the Israelite camp and eventually into the land of Israel, eventually into the temple, etc., etc. And it is the most sacred of sacred mementos of the desert encounter with the divine. Okay, so we have this big box. And what's in it? What's in the box? Okay, so of course, it's Aron HaBrit, so there's the Brit, there is the covenant, so the Ark of the Covenant, which means the tablets, right? Luchot HaBrit, the tablets of the law. And crucially, there is something else there with the tablets. And as it says, in addition, as a memento of the desert encounter with the divine, we also have a jar of manna. Okay, and how much? How big a jar? Is it a quart? Is it a gallon? Well, it's the biblical measure of an omer. Okay, again, connecting us to the counting of the omer. And we are told in Exodus 16, what is an omer of manna? It is devar yom b'yomo. That is the sort of daily portion of human consumption. Okay. So what's interesting about this is that there's a little bit sort of a discussion in the rabbinic sources about the commandments, right? Because remember, we had those first set of commandments that were divine, according to the story, right? God etched the commandments, the luchot, the tablets in the divine with the divine hand, but Moses broke those coming down from Mount Sinai upon seeing the golden calf, et cetera, et cetera. And so Moses had to go back up. And then the second tablets were what Moses actually carved and wrote down, etc. And so the rabbinic statement is that what was in the Aron HaBrit, what was in this Ark of the Covenant, luchot v'shivrei luchot. Okay, it both had the second tablets, which were complete, but they also preserved those fragments, those shards of the original broken tablets. So picture this, okay? You have in the Aron HaBrit, you have the first tablets, which were divine but broken, and you have the second tablets, which are whole but human, and next to them you have a little jar of what was described as white flaky stuff. Okay, in other words, right? Just in this kind of blows my mind when I think about it. Manna and what it symbolizes, which is to say the very sabbatical, anti-accumulationist, radical egalitarian culture of each according to their needs, this whole society, those things are on a level with the Decalogue, with the Ten Commandments and the Torah that are in there. In other words, this is meant to encapsulate the essence of divine teaching, no less than the actual text of Revelation. And that's why, again, this is just like Shmita, the manna is not some weird curiosity of some bizarre, mythical, whatever kind of miraculous thing. It's meant to signify all these teachings together, and that's why it's there in the Aron. It's meant to be treated with the same respect as a vision of how we are to live. Okay, and that's why that Omer of manna, that's where we're meant to count day in and day out for 49 days to bring us from slavery to the mountain, from Egypt to the teaching of anti-Egypt. Okay, so this Parashat Behar is what it's called, and it starts with this idea that these were the things that were said at Har Sinai, and at first mentioned Shmita. And Rashi has a famous question about this, Ma'inyan Shmita etzel Har Sinai. Why in the world would specifically the teaching of Shmita be the one to be mentioned as connected to specifically the revelation at Mount Sinai? And so I hope now it's clear, because my whole goal here was to show how Shmita is completely integrated into the larger narrative arc of the history of Jewish people and a complete embodiment of our core values. Now, interestingly, Jewish tradition, right, in Pesach and Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, the memory of leaving Egypt, we make a huge deal of having been slaves in Egypt, right, and the exodus from there, and all what Pesach is about, et cetera, et cetera. And it, not only in the Pesach and Seder, but also in the ubiquity of Shabbat, which is an ever-present, a weekly reminder. And so we sort of know what that means, or at least we explore it every year and talk about it. But that was just the beginning, right? That was the first step of the journey. It's the going out into the desert and into the unknown. And there we receive the manna and all that represents, which sustained us in our wanderings and got us essentially to the land, this vision of home, however we understand that. And so we actually make a much smaller deal, ritually and cultically and everything else, of having survived the desert and reached the land at all. And so that's where the manna story leaves off and where the Shemitah story begins, ki tavo el haaretz, what you do when you come into the land, how to act when you're home or when you're building a home. Okay, so to my mind, the deep message of Shmita is how to train ourselves not only to build a society that is anti-Egypt in its commitment to compassion and collective well-being and social solidarity, but to actually want to build one. And I think it's the lack of will that is one of our big issues today, because in our globalized world with widening social gaps, with more wealth being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and I have to say, if you think this is a 200-year-old story, you're wrong. I mean, part of capitalism, of course, goes back to the 18th century, but the fact that the widening social gaps and the wealth, the massive wealth being concentrated in fewer hands is a story of one generation, right? Or 1.5 generations. And when you accompany this with grinding poverty between the global north and the global south, not to mention this idea of accumulationism, which we might call consumer culture, okay? It means that our world is looking more and more like Egypt, okay? So what do we need to do? I think, rightly understood, the values both of Shabbat and Shemitah, with their deep critiques of our society and our economy, are incredibly subversive. Okay, I think that's also one of the reasons why it's not widely accepted or developed in the mainstream institutional Jewish community. And here I'm going to quote a colleague and teacher: if we would implement these on a large scale, that would be an act of Shabbatage. Sabotage by Shabbat. That is a phrase not my own, unfortunately. I credit Rabbi Amichai Lau-Levi. So that is the vision that I want to leave us with. And I hope I told this story in a comprehensive and convincing way. And now I'm curious to hear, as we say in Hebrew, like where does this meet you? What your responses and reactions are to this story?
So, Jeremy, thank you for that. I want to open the floor and invite you to simply demute yourselves and share if you have a question or a comment. I especially, in fact, want to feel free to ask anything you want, share anything you want, but I especially, in a way, want to invite questions to now sketch out the bridge that you got to right at the very, very end, Jeremy. Because I will simply say on my side, I think you did a really beautiful job. Again, one of the things I love about Shmita is like, I feel like anytime you learn it, you always learn something new. And I feel like I've learned a lot about Shmita, but I absolutely feel that I learned new things just now. But the thing that I continue to be most interested in is, how does it inflect us? How could or should it change what it means to be Jewish? How should it play out in our lives or in our institutions or in our communities? What questions does it raise? How, and so on and so on and so on. So, thoughts, comments, and questions for anybody. And go ahead and demute yourself and just tell us a sentence about where you are and then fire away. And I think I'm Ilana, I'm not going to put you on now, but I'm just going to tell you, because we didn't have any warning, but I just want to tell you that it took me a second to register why I had heard of Ilana. And if I'm not mistaken, Ilana is, I think, the first Israeli Orthodox park ranger in South Africa. And that may be why you have that photograph behind you. And to the extent that many of us in this call and this conversation are interested in connections between Jewish tradition and land, at some point I want to invite you to ask a question or say something, and we might ask you to do a session at some point in the future, because I'm fascinated personally. Anyway, the floor is open.
Oh, well, thanks, Nigel. And thanks, Jeremy. I will just start then, unless anyone else. I'll just say two things. Firstly, as an environmentalist or a game ranger as well, but as an environmentalist, I've always seen Shmita from that point of view. And I think that's also maybe put off a lot of people. So the way you turned it around and made it into that larger social justice, shall we call it, I think is something vital that people need to know about. So even though most of us that are here are going to be more, have been attracted to the subject in the first place, thanks to our various feelings or connections with environment or with Tanakh, whatever it might be. I think that's just been amazing for me. And I also want to say that I think what's fascinating for me is when you look at the prophets like Yeshayahu, Isaiah, etc., those prophets, and when they're talking about the haves and the have-nots, if you think about, to me, I feel like they could be talking today. So I think it's not even just an idea of the capitalism of the last 100 or 200 years, but rather it's definitely a problem that stretches back, well, obviously all the way to Egypt, but it applied very specifically at certain times in the call it the first Commonwealth, in the time of Isaiah, etc. So that was just my thought.
Thank you. Nakshan, you're up.
Thank you. You're
Jeremy,
speaking from darkness there, Yafshan. I don't know if you have any illumination for your face.
can you hear me though?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, I'm sorry that the light is behind me. Okay.
Okay.
No, that makes it worse. Okay. That was fabulous. I never heard the story told that way, and I think you're right on. I'm almost like, I bet there must be some kind of a medieval commentator who picked up on that, because he had the sensitivity to see the abuse that the Egyptians were doing at that point. Because now this is a Jewish conversation here, but this is obviously a global conversation, what you're talking about. And I wonder, have you had a chance to talk about this with Christians or with Muslims? And how do they respond to this idea of grounding social economic reform, for lack of a better word, in this what they call scripture, or in sacred texts and in the commandments in the Torah?
I have not really had the opportunity to share that, although there's this great project, the Green Sabbath Project, initiated by Jonathan Schorsch. You can Google that if you want. And I know that Scott Lewis, I see here, he's heard this twice already from me because he was there. And it is an interfaith kind of forum, talking about what contemporary meanings of sabbatical values could look like. And he often has all kinds of teachers from various faith traditions. So I did offer a version of that there, but I haven't really gone beyond kind of my local Jewish circles. So but you're right. It's definitely.
But I'll add a couple of things to that, if I may, because we have been interested in this. We have been floating it in other people and with other groups. We did a session at our Shmita Summit in London 7 years ago with Canon Giles Fraser, who's a significant Christian leader in England, with Danny Toe, which was a really fascinating session. One of the things that's interesting is that Shabbat is both Jewish and Christian, as it were. It's part of the world at this point. And so, strangely enough, is Yovel, the Jubilee, which is also in this Parsha. And it's in this week's Parsha that we have the line that appears on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. And one of the Americans here will quote it better than I will. Let justice
proclaim liberty throughout the land.
Proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all its inhabitants thereof. Right? So what's interesting is that the American Pilgrims, Puritans, take that from this week's Parsha and are really interested in Jubilee. And in the late 1990s, in Britain, there was essentially a Christian-Jewish campaign for third world debt relief for the millennial, which actually had some real traction and had some real impact, partly because Tony Blair, who was at that time Prime Minister, and Gordon Brown, who was at that time the equivalent of the Finance Minister, were both religious Christians. Gordon Brown was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and Tony Blair converted to Catholicism after he ceased to be Prime Minister. And so from an explicitly Christian place, as well as politicians, they sort of got this. And so what's interesting to me is that there is, as it were, Christian and broader traction about Shabbat. There is Christian and broader traction around the notion of Jubilee. And between those two, Shmita is kind of a missing link. And it's one of the reasons I say to everybody here, again, I remind you what I said at the start, that we're all ambassadors for the idea of Shmita. I think Shmita is far, far too good an idea to keep only with Jews. in any of the texts that Jeremy's been referring with, any of you who are like, want to study this in a mixed place of work, or want to do it with a synagogue and local church or a local mosque, these texts open up really rich conversations. Other thoughts,
Absolutely.
comments, or questions?
I have a question.
Hi.
Jason
Jason.
Gitlin from Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn. Just on that point of kind of the particular and universal within Shabbat and Shmita, it would seem like, one of the things I kind of tension I feel is that Shmita, for it to really have its full value, would have to be beyond the Jewish community, right? It would seem like that's really the. On the other hand, many of the texts about it seem to try to make it so particular by the land elements, only the land of Israel, and all these elements. Whereas, yeah. So just I guess my question is kind of like speak to this tension between. Do you see it particularly in Shmita? Where is this universal? Like I say, my expectation is that for it to really fully be felt, they would have had this vision that this is where the world eventually has to be, and yet they limited it in the initial text so strictly to the Jewish people, not just the Jewish people, the land of Israel. And it was kind of like, how has that been explored, or are there ways that that's been addressed?
I think that is, I'd love to hear other people's perspectives, but I think that is one of the desiderata of our times. I mean, we are, as I think Nigel put it in his introduction, the idea of a chazon is sort of focusing Judaism outward onto the world, and not only thinking about our own internal relationships, our own internal needs, which are of course also important, but I think that this might be the call of our generation to think about how this really should be applied into the world, which we are so integrally a part of.
And again, I want to add to that. I not only agree with that, but I want to add that this is one of the things that's interesting about having somebody teaching us from Israel, and most of us not being in Israel. Because in Israel, every 7 years, this does have consequences. And it does apply. If you're a farmer, you decide if you observe it or not. If you're a consumer, does it matter to you or not? But for every one of us who doesn't live in Israel, arguably, there is no difference between us and anybody who's Christian or Muslim or anything else. In a formal halachic Jewish religious sense, there is nothing on Shmita that binds any one of us any more than it binds anybody of any religious background. And so to some extent, in a sense, we're engaging Shmita not as that which is a requirement upon me. There isn't any requirement there for those of us who live in Brooklyn or Manhattan. It's rather, here is a piece of the ancient wisdom of the Jewish people and of Jewish tradition. Maybe this has salience for like America right now and the world right now, which is exactly the points that Jeremy was making when he's juxtaposing Shmita ultimately with a certain kind of like overconsumptive consumerism. The notion of actually having frames and text that start to open us into those questions gently rather than bang us over the head is kind of fascinating. Scott, you're up.
Thank you, Nigel. I just had a question, Jeremy. You've got so many ideas packed into here. I know. Well, that's one of the reasons I guess we have multiple sessions so we can unpack some of this. But I have a question that I got a cognitive conflict about it, specifically when you talk about the Shemitah year when they entered the land. And this you can help because you're in Israel with the geography a little bit, but I'm thinking, I'm reading these stories in the Bible, and this is where maybe a gap I'm having is I'm thinking of them coming into the land and doing all these war things with Joshua and all these other things, having conflicts with the neighbors. So it wasn't like they were necessarily going into an empty land, and maybe that's where I'm not understanding. But if they were commanded not to sit down someplace and have a farm, maybe they would get into their conflicts with their neighbors about harvesting food from all these other places. What can you say anything about that? Or is that, you would almost develop a war culture rather than a peace culture if you didn't have your own land there.
Yeah, I sort of conveniently ignored some of the details of the biblical text, which talk about forcibly conquering a land that is populated, and there's no question of that. That's part of the biblical vision. There's none of this, land without a people, et cetera, et cetera. and I don't have a good answer for that, except that actually, I think biblical scholars, when they deal, like from the academic point of view, when they deal with some of these more problematic things about wiping out the native inhabitants, etc., is saying that from anything we can see from the reality of life several hundreds of years later, is that there was no wiping out that ever went on. Like there was definitely a sort of some sort of coexistence that happened. And so how to square this kind of idealized or sort of spiritual story that I'm telling for our purposes, and that with various versions of what may or may not have happened 2,500 years ago, I don't know. I don't ask those questions so much, but there might be some productive avenue of inquiry in trying to figure out kind of what that dynamic might have been like. And I see that somebody wrote something in the chat. I'll just, Nigel wrote it, so you can say that if you want.
Well, it's me saying fundamentally Shmita is about sharing. And I think as we're coming into land, I just want to invite 2 or 3 people, just go ahead and demute yourself. Just want to hear, just in one sentence, one specific thing you're thinking about, you've enjoyed, you've been provoked by. Just go ahead. Jean, you're up. You're on mute. Jean, you need to demute yourself. There you go.
Especially the way Jeremy told it makes Shmita within the narrative so much about intersectionality, which is what we need to understand now in America and everywhere, that it all depends on economic justice, environmental justice, the planet. I mean, it's just all interconnected.
Thank you. Sue, you're up.
So I'm struck by the question we can ask ourselves: do we want to be the Joseph kind of Jew? And I will admit he's never been my favorite, who both feeds people and makes impoverished serfs out of them? Or do we want to be the kind of Jew who puts the manna in the Ark of the Covenant? And I think that's a really deep question that people are going to be really pissed off to have to answer. Speaking for my own Jewish community, Joseph is Joseph. So I'm just sort of playing with how we ask that question in a way that doesn't blow people's heads up or off. Oh.
Thank you. And I've got Wendy, and then Jeremy, Rabbi Jeremy, and then Alyssa.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. This is recorded, right? So I can pick up what I did. Good. Yeah. Okay. What I'm taking and what I'm appreciating from what I heard was that we, as Adam, as humans, need to start not with doing, but with being, that we need to start in that resting place first. Now that we are not struggling with liberation in the sense of coming from Mitzrayim. And I just think it's a beautiful metaphor to actually not think about what is it that we need to do first, but the first thing we need to do is to be and connect with the land and connect with ourselves and connect with the divine. Thank you. And I'm coming from San Francisco Bay Area.
Thank you. Rabbi Schwartz.
First of all, it was just wonderful teaching. I found myself struggling with, as I often do with Shmita, thinking, oh, but it's so impractical, and God's not going to make the land produce twice as much in the 6th year, and then I had this little argument with myself thinking, Schwartz, that's what people say to you about Shabbat. Like, your kids even, I can't finish all my homework if I don't work on Saturday, like I can't, there's no way, you can't take a day off. And so there's some bit about just reorienting our minds to, hey, the earth is really productive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Alyssa.
Hey there. I'm coming from Jerusalem, and something I'm leaving. Yeah, it's pretty great. And something I'm leaving thinking about is this idea that you brought up of the agricultural, just watching the land for 4 seasons. And I have been in school as long as I can remember. And I'm thinking about like, who am I outside of grad school? Who am I outside of my work? And who am I when I let myself not overwork myself for 4 seasons? I don't know who that person is. I've never been that person. So I'm looking forward to thinking about this next year. Thank you. Really, really thank you.
Alyssa, those were appropriate last words. I want to thank every single person for joining us. I want to Bruce for thank you for setting it up. Jeremy, I want to thank you honestly for marvelous teaching. And we look forward to seeing you this time next week.